Sometimes the cruelest moments in life become the doorway to our greatest destiny. When 12-year-old Samuel Thompson was left on a dusty trail with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of broken dreams, he had no idea that this moment of abandonment would lead him to riches beyond imagination. This is the true story of how a boy who lost everything found more than he ever dared to hope for, and how one man's kindness changed the course of two lives forever. The year was 1923, and the American West was still a place where fortunes could be made or lost on the turn of fate. Samuel's story begins not with his triumph, but with the darkest day of his young life, the day his stepmother decided he was no longer worth keeping, and how that cruel decision accidentally delivered him into the hands of the most powerful rancher in 3 counties. What happened next would become legend in the small town of Cedar Ridge, a tale of unexpected mercy, hard work, and the kind of love that transcends blood relations. This is not just a story about finding wealth. It's about finding family where you least expect it, about proving your worth when everyone has given up on you, and about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever could have happened. Samuel Thompson's journey from abandoned orphan to beloved heir will restore your faith in human kindness and remind you that every ending is really just a new beginning in disguise. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty trail as 12-year-old Samuel Thompson sat on his small wooden suitcase, watching the wagon that had carried him disappear over the hill. The sound of horses' hooves and creaking wheels faded into the distance, leaving behind only the whisper of wind through the sagebrush and the heavy silence of abandonment. His stepmother, Martha, had not even looked back. Samuel's story began 3 years earlier, when his father, Thomas Thompson, had married Martha Wilson, a widow with 2 children of her own. Thomas had been a kind man who worked as a blacksmith in the small town of Cedar Ridge, Colorado. He had promised Samuel that Martha would be like a real mother to him, that they would be a proper family at last. For a while, it seemed like that promise might come true. Martha had been different when Thomas was alive. She cooked Samuel's favorite meals, mended his clothes, and even helped him with his reading lessons by the fireplace in the evenings. Her own children, Lucy and James, had accepted Samuel as their brother, and for the first time since his birth mother died when he was 6, Samuel felt like he belonged somewhere. But everything changed the winter. Thomas caught pneumonia. The illness came suddenly and took him just as fast, leaving behind a small house, a struggling blacksmith business, and 4 people who barely knew how to survive without him. Martha tried to keep the blacksmith shop running, but she knew nothing about metalwork, and customers stopped coming. The bills piled up like autumn leaves, and soon she was forced to sell the business and most of their belongings. The change in Martha was swift and cruel. Without Thomas there to remind her of the promises she had made, Samuel became nothing more than an extra mouth to feed. She began treating him differently from her own children. While Lucy and James got full plates at dinner, Samuel received scraps. While they slept in warm beds, he was moved to a cold corner of the kitchen. When neighbors asked about the boy, Martha would complain loudly about the burden of caring for someone else's child. Samuel tried his best to make himself useful. He chopped wood, carried water, helped with cooking, and did whatever chores Martha assigned him. He hoped that if he worked hard enough, if he made himself valuable enough, she might remember the woman who had once treated him with kindness. But Martha's heart had hardened like iron left too long in the cold, and nothing Samuel did seemed to matter. The final blow came when Martha received a letter from her sister in California. The sister, who had struck it rich during the gold rush years, was offering to take Martha and her children in, to give them a fresh start in a place where opportunities were still plentiful. But the invitation was clear. It was for Martha and her 2 natural children only. There was no mention of Samuel, no provision for an extra boy who shared no blood with their family. Martha saw this as her salvation, her chance to escape the poverty that had trapped them in Cedar Ridge. She began making plans immediately, selling what remained of their possessions, and preparing for the long journey west. When Samuel asked about the arrangements, she told him he would be staying behind with a local family who had agreed to take him in. It was a lie, but Samuel believed it because he wanted to believe it, because the alternative was too terrible to imagine. The morning of their departure, Martha loaded her children and their belongings into a hired wagon. She told Samuel to gather his few possessions and climb aboard, saying they would drop him off at his new home on the way out of town. Samuel's heart was breaking at the thought of being separated from the only family he had left, but he climbed into the wagon obediently, clutching his small suitcase with everything he owned in the world. They traveled for several hours along dusty trails that led away from Cedar Ridge. Samuel recognized none of the landscape they passed through, but he trusted that Martha knew where she was taking him. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and still they continued traveling through increasingly desolate country. Finally, as they reached a crossroads where several trails met in the middle of nowhere, Martha told the wagon driver to stop. She turned to Samuel with eyes as cold as winter stones and told him to get out. When he asked where the family was that was supposed to take him in, she laughed bitterly and said there was no family, that he was old enough to make his own way in the world. She threw his suitcase down beside him and told the driver to continue without looking back. Samuel stood frozen in disbelief as the wagon rolled away. He called after Martha, begging her not to leave him, promising to be better, to work harder, to never be any trouble. But his words were carried away by the wind, and the wagon disappeared over a hill, leaving him alone in a landscape that stretched empty in all directions. The reality of his situation hit him like a physical blow. He was 12 years old, alone, with no food, no money, and no idea where he was. The nearest town could be miles away in any direction, and he had no way of knowing which trail might lead to safety. The sun was already past its peak, and he knew that when darkness fell, the desert could become deadly cold. Samuel sat down on his suitcase and began to cry. These were not the quiet tears of sadness, but the deep, wrenching sobs of a child who has lost everything he ever loved. He cried for his father, who had promised to always protect him. He cried for Martha, who had once sung him lullabies and tucked him into bed. He cried for the home that was never really his, and for the future that had just been stolen from him. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel's tears dried up, replaced by a grim determination to survive. His father had taught him to be strong, to face whatever life threw at him with courage and dignity. He would not die on this trail like an abandoned animal. He would find his way to safety no matter how long it took or how difficult the journey became. He picked up his suitcase and began walking along the trail that seemed to head toward distant mountains, hoping it might lead to a town, or at least a ranch where he could find help. His feet were already sore in his thin shoes, and the suitcase seemed to grow heavier with each step, but he kept moving forward, because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant dying. The landscape around him was harsh but beautiful in its own way. Rolling hills covered with sagebrush and scrub oak stretched towards snow-capped peaks that looked impossibly far away. Occasionally, he would see a hawk circling overhead, or catch a glimpse of a rabbit darting between the bushes, but mostly there was just the endless expanse of wilderness and the sound of his own footsteps on the rocky trail. As evening approached, Samuel began to worry about where he would spend the night. The temperature was already dropping, and he could see storm clouds gathering around the mountain peaks. He had no blanket, no way to make fire, and no shelter except whatever he might find along the trail. He quickened his pace, hoping to find some kind of refuge before darkness fell completely. Just as the last light was fading from the sky, Samuel spotted something that made his heart leap with hope. In the distance, barely visible against the darkening landscape, he could see the warm glow of lights that could only mean one thing: a house. And where there was a house, there were people who might help him. He broke into a run, his suitcase banging against his leg with every step, but he did not care about the pain. Those lights represented salvation, the difference between life and death on this cold mountain night. As he got closer, he could see that the lights came from a large ranch house set in a valley between two hills. There were barns and outbuildings scattered around the main house, and he could hear the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. Samuel had found the Broken Arrow Ranch, though he did not know its name yet. He did not know that he had stumbled onto the property of William Hartley, the wealthiest cattle rancher in 3 counties. He did not know that this meeting would change his life forever. All he knew was that there were people ahead who might show him kindness, who might give him food and shelter, and help him figure out what to do next. He approached the ranch house on trembling legs, exhausted from hours of walking and overcome with relief at finally finding civilization. The house was larger than any he had ever seen, with a wide front porch and lights glowing warmly in every window. Through one window he could see the silhouettes of people moving around inside, and the sight of human activity after hours of desperate solitude nearly brought him to tears again. Samuel walked up to the front door and raised his small fist to knock, not knowing that this single action would set in motion a chain of events that would transform him from an abandoned orphan into the heir of one of the largest ranches in Colorado. All he knew was that he needed help, and this was his only hope of finding it before the cold mountain night claimed him forever. The door of the Broken Arrow Ranch house opened before Samuel could finish knocking. A tall, weathered man with silver hair and kind blue eyes stood in the doorway, backlit by the warm glow from inside the house. This was William Hartley, though Samuel did not know it yet. What he saw was simply a man who looked at him with concern rather than suspicion. and that alone was enough to make Samuel's knees weak with relief. William Hartley was 62 years old and had spent his entire adult life building his ranch from nothing into one of the most successful operations in Colorado. He had arrived in the territory as a young man with nothing but determination and a gift for understanding cattle and land. Through hard work, smart decisions, and fair dealing with his neighbors, he had accumulated thousands of acres of prime grazing land and built a fortune that made him one of the most respected men in the region. But for all his success, William carried a deep sadness that money could never heal. He and his wife Eleanor had never been able to have children of their own. They had tried for years, hoping and praying for a son or daughter to carry on the ranch legacy that William had worked so hard to build. Eleanor had suffered 3 miscarriages that left her heartbroken and eventually made her too afraid to try again. The silence in their large house had grown heavier with each passing year, filled with the echoes of children's laughter they would never hear. Eleanor had died 2 years earlier from a fever that came suddenly and took her before the doctor could even be summoned from town. William had been left alone in the big house with only his ranch hands and housekeeper for company. He threw himself into his work with even greater intensity, expanding his herds and acquiring new land, but nothing could fill the emptiness that had settled into his heart. Now, standing in his doorway, looking down at a small, exhausted boy, with tears streaking down his dirty face, William felt something stir in his chest that he had not felt in years. It was more than simple compassion for someone in need. It was a recognition of something that went deeper than circumstances, a connection that transcended the usual boundaries between stranger and friend. Samuel looked up at the tall rancher and tried to speak, but the words would not come. He was exhausted, frightened, and overwhelmed by the events of the day. All he could do was stand there holding his small suitcase and hope that this man would not turn him away into the cold darkness that was settling over the mountains. William did not need words to understand the situation. He had seen enough of life to recognize desperation when it appeared on his doorstep. He stepped aside and gestured for Samuel to come inside, speaking in the gentle voice he might have used with a frightened animal. "Come in, son," William said. The word son coming naturally, though they had just met. "You look like you could use some food and a warm place to rest." The interior of the ranch house was unlike anything Samuel had ever seen. Rich wood paneling covered the walls, and expensive rugs lay scattered across polished hardwood floors. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with a fire crackling warmly in the hearth. Leather furniture was arranged in comfortable groupings, and oil paintings of landscapes and cattle decorated the walls. Everything spoke of wealth and comfort, but also of loneliness. It was clearly a house built for a family, but occupied by only one man. Samuel stood uncertainly in the entryway, afraid to step further into such magnificence with his dusty clothes and worn shoes. He had never been inside a house so grand, and he felt like his presence might somehow damage or soil the beautiful surroundings. William noticed the boy's hesitation and smiled kindly. "Don't worry about the dirt, son. This house has seen plenty of mud and dust over the years. What's your name, and what brings you to my doorstep on such a cold night?" "I'm Samuel Thompson," the boy managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I was left on the trail. My stepmother. She said there wasn't room for me where they were going." William felt a flash of anger at any woman who could abandon a child in the wilderness, but he kept his voice calm and reassuring. "Well, Samuel Thompson, you're safe now. When did you last have something to eat?" Samuel had to think about it. Martha had given him a piece of bread that morning before they left Cedar Ridge, but that seemed like days ago now. "This morning, sir." "Just some bread." William nodded and called out toward the back of the house. "Maria, could you bring some food to the dining room? We have a hungry young guest who needs looking after." Maria Gonzalez had been William's housekeeper for 15 years, ever since he and Eleanor had first built the big house. She was a motherly woman in her 50s who had raised 6 children of her own and had endless patience for anyone in need of care. She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, took one look at Samuel, and immediately understood the situation. "Ay, pobrecito," she murmured, switching to her native Spanish, as she often did when moved by emotion. "Come, Niño, let me get you fed properly." She bustled Samuel into the dining room, where a long table made of polished oak dominated the space. Within minutes, she had produced a plate piled high with roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh bread with butter. She poured a tall glass of milk and set it beside the plate, then stood back with her arms crossed, watching to make sure Samuel ate every bite. Samuel had never seen so much food on one plate in his entire life. During the lean months after his father died, meals had become smaller and smaller, and he had grown used to going to bed with his stomach only half full now. Faced with more food than he usually saw in 3 days, he hardly knew where to begin. He ate slowly at first, afraid that this might be some kind of test or trick, that the food might be taken away if he showed too much enthusiasm. But as William and Maria watched him with warm, encouraging smiles, he began to relax and eat with the hunger of a boy who had walked for hours on an empty stomach. While Samuel ate, William asked gentle questions about his background. The story that emerged was heartbreaking, but all too common in those days when families were broken by death and economic hardship. William learnt about Samuel's father, the blacksmith who had died too young, about Martha's growing resentment and final cruelty, about the long walk along the mountain trail that had brought him to this doorstep. With each detail Samuel shared, William felt his anger at the boy's stepmother growing stronger. But more than anger, he felt a growing sense of connection to this abandoned child who had somehow found his way to the Broken Arrow Ranch. There was something about Samuel's quiet dignity, his refusal to complain or ask for pity, that reminded William of himself at that age. William had grown up poor on a small farm in Kansas, where his own father had died when William was only 14. He knew what it was like to face an uncertain future with nothing but determination and hope to sustain him. He had worked his way west through hard labor and careful savings, always dreaming of the day when he would have enough land and cattle to build something lasting. But now, looking at Samuel, William realized that all his success meant nothing if he had no one to share it with, no one to pass it on to when his time came. He had built an empire, but had no heir to inherit it. The lawyers in town were always advising him to choose a nephew or cousin to leave his wealth to, but William had never felt right about leaving his life's work to distant relatives who had never shared his struggles or understood his dreams. When Samuel finished eating, Maria brought a basin of warm water and clean towels so he could wash the dust of the trail from his face and hands. Then she led him to a comfortable guest room on the second floor, with a real bed made up with clean sheets and warm blankets. Samuel had not slept in a proper bed since leaving Cedar Ridge, and the sight of such comfort brought tears to his eyes again. William appeared in the doorway as Maria was turning down the bed covers. "You'll stay here tonight, Samuel," he said. "Tomorrow we can talk about what comes next. For now, just rest and don't worry about anything else." Samuel wanted to thank the rancher for his kindness, to express somehow the gratitude he felt for being saved from a night in the cold wilderness. But the events of the day had exhausted him beyond words, and all he could manage was a whispered, "Thank you, sir." William smiled and closed the door softly, leaving Samuel alone for the first time since being abandoned on the trail. The boy looked around the room in wonder. It was larger than the entire kitchen where he had slept at Martha's house, with real furniture, clean curtains at the windows, and even a small bookshelf filled with leather-bound volumes. He changed into the nightshirt that Maria had left for him, then knelt beside the bed to say the prayers his father had taught him years ago. He thanked God for leading him to safety, for the kindness of strangers, and for the food and warm bed that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Then he climbed between the clean sheets and closed his eyes, feeling safe for the first time in months. Downstairs, William sat in his study, staring into the fire and thinking about the events of the evening. He had acted on instinct when he invited the boy inside, moved by simple human compassion to help someone in desperate need. But now, as he reflected on their conversation and observed Samuel's character, he began to see possibilities that went far beyond a single night's charity. The boy was clearly intelligent and well-mannered despite his recent hardships. He had shown gratitude without servility, dignity without pride, and a maturity that suggested he could handle responsibility beyond his years. Most importantly, there was something about him that felt right to William, a sense that this meeting had been more than simple coincidence. William had always believed that everything happened for a reason, that God had a plan even when it was not immediately clear to human understanding. Eleanor used to say that the right people came into your life exactly when you needed them most, and sitting here now, William wondered if Samuel Thompson might be the answer to prayers he had stopped believing would ever be answered. He made a decision that night that would change both their lives forever. Tomorrow he would offer Samuel more than just temporary shelter. He would offer him a home, a future, and eventually, if things worked out as William hoped they might, he would offer him something that no amount of money could buy: a family and a legacy to call his own. But for tonight, it was enough that a lost boy had found safety, and that a lonely man had found purpose again. The Broken Arrow Ranch had gained more than a guest that evening. It had gained the possibility of becoming a true home again, filled with the laughter and activity that had been missing for too long. As the fire died down to glowing embers, William climbed the stairs to his own room, passing the guest room, where Samuel slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. He could hear the boy's quiet breathing through the door, and the sound filled him with a contentment he had not felt since Eleanor's death. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions that would affect both their futures. But tonight, all was well at the Broken Arrow Ranch, where an abandoned boy had found sanctuary, and a childless man had found hope. Samuel woke to the sound of roosters crowing and sunlight streaming through windows that faced the eastern mountains. For a moment he was confused, unable to remember where he was or how he had gotten into such a comfortable bed. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back. The abandonment on the trail, the long walk through the wilderness, and the unexpected kindness of the tall rancher who had taken him in. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted up from the kitchen below, making Samuel's stomach growl with hunger. He dressed quickly in his worn clothes from the day before, then made his way downstairs, uncertain of what he would find or what would be expected of him. William was already seated at the dining room table, reading a newspaper, while Maria served breakfast. When he saw Samuel appear in the doorway, he folded the paper and gestured to an empty chair beside him. "Good morning, Samuel. I hope you slept well. Come sit down and have some breakfast. We have a lot to talk about today." The breakfast was as generous as the dinner had been. Eggs, bacon, pancakes, fresh fruit, and milk that was still warm from the cow. Samuel ate gratefully while William observed him quietly, noting how the boy used his utensils properly and remembered to say please and thank you. Despite his recent hardships, Samuel had clearly been raised with good manners and respect for others. When they finished eating, William led Samuel outside to show him around the ranch. The Broken Arrow spread across thousands of acres of prime grazing land, with rolling pastures that stretched toward the mountains in every direction. Hundreds of cattle dotted the landscape, and Samuel could see cowboys on horseback moving among the herds in the distance. The ranch buildings were impressive in their scope and quality. Besides the main house, there were several barns for storing hay and equipment, a stable for the horses, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and various other outbuildings that served different purposes in the operation. Everything was well maintained and organized, evidence of the attention to detail that had made William Hartley successful. As they walked, William explained how the ranch operated. The cattle were the main source of income, raised on the rich grasslands and sold to markets in Denver and other cities. The ranch employed about 20 cowboys and support staff, making it one of the largest employers in the region. During certain seasons, like spring roundup and fall cattle drives, the number of workers would double as temporary hands were brought in to help with the extra work. Samuel listened intently to everything William told him, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was genuinely interested in learning about ranch life. He had never been around cattle before, but he was fascinated by the complex system of breeding, grazing, and marketing that kept the operation profitable. The key to success in the cattle business, William explained as they stopped to watch a group of cowboys working with a herd, is understanding that every decision you make affects everything else. The quality of your grass determines the health of your cattle. The health of your cattle determines the price you can get at market. The price you get determines how much you can reinvest in improving your operation. After the tour of the ranch buildings, William introduced Samuel to some of the key people who worked at the Broken Arrow. There was Jake Morrison, the foreman who had been with William for over 10 years and knew every aspect of ranch management. Red Sullivan was the head wrangler, responsible for the care and training of the horses. Tom Bradley managed the cattle operations, keeping track of breeding records and health issues. Each man greeted Samuel with curious but friendly interest. It was unusual for the boss to bring a young boy around on a tour of the ranch, and they all wondered what William's plans might be. But they had worked for William long enough to trust his judgment, and if he said the boy was welcome at the Broken Arrow, that was good enough for them. The most important introduction came when they visited the barn where an old cowboy named Pete Hawkins was mending a saddle. Pete was in his 70s and had worked on ranches all his life. His hands were gnarled from years of hard work. His face was weathered like old leather, but his eyes were sharp and kind. William had kept him on, even though Pete could no longer handle the demanding physical work, because his knowledge and experience were invaluable. "Pete," William said, "I'd like you to meet Samuel Thompson. He's going to be staying with us for a while, and I was hoping you might teach him some of the basics of ranch work." Pete looked Samuel up and down with the practiced eye of someone who had sized up countless young men over the years. He saw a boy who was small for his age but had intelligent eyes and a determined set to his jaw. Most importantly, he saw someone who looked eager to learn rather than expecting to be handed everything. "Well now," Pete said in a voice roughened by years of calling to cattle across wide pastures, "you ever worked with horses before, son?" "No, sir." Samuel replied honestly. "I've never been on a ranch before, but I'm willing to learn whatever you think I should know." Pete nodded approvingly. "Honesty's a good start. Most boys your age come in here thinking they know everything already. Let's see what you're made of." And so began Samuel's education in ranch life. Pete became his primary teacher, starting with the most basic skills and gradually building up to more complex tasks. The first lesson was simply learning to be comfortable around horses, understanding their temperaments, and learning to approach them safely. Samuel discovered that horses were much larger and more powerful than he had imagined, but also more intelligent and responsive than he had expected. Under Pete's patient guidance, he learned to brush and saddle a gentle old mare named Buttercup, who seemed to understand that she was dealing with a nervous beginner and tolerated his clumsy efforts with remarkable patience. The days quickly fell into a routine. Samuel would wake early, have breakfast with William, then report to Pete for his daily lessons. They would work with horses in the morning, learning about their care and handling. Afternoons might be spent learning to mend fences, repair equipment, or help with whatever tasks needed doing around the ranch. In the evenings, Samuel would have dinner with William, and afterward, they would often sit in the study while William taught him about the business side of ranching. Samuel learned to read cattle market reports, understand breeding records, and calculate the costs of various operations. William was impressed by how quickly the boy picked up new concepts and how eagerly he absorbed every piece of information. But it was not all work. William made sure Samuel had time for other activities as well. There was a good library in the house, and Samuel spent many evenings reading books about history, adventure, and the natural world. William also taught him to play chess, and they would often spend an hour after dinner engaged in friendly but competitive games. As the weeks passed, Samuel began to show real aptitude for ranch work. Pete was surprised by how quickly the boy progressed from nervous beginner to competent helper. Samuel had good instincts with animals, steady hands for detailed work, and most importantly, he was willing to try anything and learn from his mistakes. "That boy's got something special," Pete told William one evening, after Samuel had successfully helped him doctor a sick calf. "He's not afraid of hard work, and he listens when you tell him something. Most young folks these days think they know better than their elders, but Samuel actually pays attention." William was pleased but not surprised by Pete's assessment. He had seen the same qualities in Samuel from their first meeting: intelligence, determination, and a maturity that went beyond his years. But more than that, William was beginning to see something else in the boy, something that gave him hope for the future of the Broken Arrow Ranch. Samuel was not just learning to do ranch work, he was learning to think like a rancher. When they encountered a problem, he would think through possible solutions and ask questions that showed he understood the broader implications. When they visited different parts of the ranch, he would remember details from previous trips and make connections that impressed both William and the experienced cowboys. One morning in late summer, about 2 months after Samuel's arrival, William decided to take him on a ride to check some of the more distant pastures. They rode for several hours through country that was spectacularly beautiful, with wildflowers covering the meadows and snow-capped peaks visible in the distance. As they stopped to rest beside a creek, William asked Samuel how he was settling into ranch life. The boy thought for a moment before answering, his face serious as he considered the question. "I like it here more than anywhere I've ever been," Samuel said finally. "Everyone treats me like I belong, like I'm part of something important. I never had that before, even when my father was alive. Back then I was just a kid who needed taking care of. Here I feel like I'm actually contributing something useful." William felt a warmth spread through his chest at the boy's words. This was exactly what he had hoped to hear. Confirmation that Samuel was not just grateful for charity, but was genuinely becoming part of the ranch family. "You are contributing," William assured him. "Pete tells me you're one of the best students he's ever had. The other men have noticed too. They say you work hard and don't complain about anything." Samuel flushed with pride at the praise, but then his expression became more serious. "Mr. Hartley, I've been wondering about something. You've been so good to me, given me everything I could need, but I don't really understand why. I mean, you didn't know me when you took me in. Most people would have just pointed me toward town and told me to find the sheriff." William had been expecting this question for weeks, and he had given considerable thought to how he would answer it. The truth was that his feelings about Samuel had evolved far beyond simple charity, but he was not sure the boy was ready to hear about the plans that were beginning to form in his mind. "Sometimes," William said carefully, "we make decisions that feel right even when we can't fully explain them. When I saw you at my door that night, something told me you were meant to be here. Maybe it was seeing something of myself in you. Maybe it was just believing that good people deserve a chance to prove themselves. All I know is that having you here has made this place feel more like a home than it has in years." Samuel nodded, accepting the explanation, even though he sensed there was more to it than William was saying. He was beginning to understand that adults sometimes had reasons for things that they were not ready to share, and he was content to let the mystery remain for now. What mattered was that he had found a place where he belonged, where his efforts were appreciated and his potential was recognized. The abandoned boy who had been left on a mountain trail was transforming into a capable young rancher who could hold his own among men who had spent their entire lives working with cattle and horses. As they rode back toward the ranch house that afternoon, Samuel felt a contentment he had never known before. The future was still uncertain. He did not know how long William would want him to stay or what would happen to him when he grew older. But for now, he was exactly where he wanted to be, learning valuable skills from good people who treated him with respect and kindness. Behind him, William rode with a slight smile on his weathered face, watching the boy who had ridden so confidently through country that would have intimidated many grown men. Samuel was exceeding every expectation, proving himself worthy of the investment William had made in him. Soon it would be time to have a more serious conversation about the future, to share with Samuel the dreams that were beginning to take shape in the older man's mind. But today, it was enough to ride together across the land that William loved more than anything else in the world, knowing that he was no longer alone in appreciating its beauty and potential. The Broken Arrow Ranch had found its heir, even if neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge it yet. The first real test of Samuel's character came during the autumn cattle drive, when the Broken Arrow's herd had to be moved from the high summer pastures down to the winter range, closer to the ranch buildings. It was one of the most demanding times of the year, requiring every available man to work long hours under difficult conditions to ensure the cattle reached safety before the harsh mountain winter set in. William had been debating whether Samuel was ready for such a challenging undertaking. The boy had made remarkable progress during his months at the ranch, but a cattle drive was different from the everyday tasks he had been learning. It required stamina, quick thinking, and the ability to work as part of a team under pressure. One mistake could scatter hundreds of cattle across miles of rough country or result in serious injury to man or beast. Samuel had been listening to the cowboys talk about the upcoming drive for weeks, watching their preparations with obvious longing. When William finally asked if he thought he was ready to participate, the boy's face lit up with excitement and determination. "I know I'm not as experienced as the other men," Samuel said earnestly, "but I'll do whatever job you think I can handle. I won't let you down." Pete Hawkins had been consulted about Samuel's readiness, and the old cowboy's assessment was cautiously positive. "The boy's got good instincts and he listens to instruction," Pete told William. "He won't panic if things get rough, and he knows enough about horses and cattle to be useful rather than just getting in the way." So it was decided that Samuel would join the drive, assigned to work alongside Jake Morrison, the foreman, where he could learn from one of the most experienced cattlemen on the ranch, while staying close enough to supervision to avoid serious trouble. The drive began before dawn on a crisp October morning, with 20 cowboys, 400 head of cattle, and a remuda of extra horses stretching out across the mountain landscape. Samuel rode near the middle of the group, his heart pounding with excitement and nervous energy. This was what he had been preparing for during all those months of training, his chance to prove that he belonged among these seasoned ranch hands. The first day went smoothly. The cattle were still fresh and manageable, the weather was clear, and the experienced cowboys made the complex operation look deceptively easy. Samuel's job was primarily to help maintain the loose formation of the herd, riding along the edges to keep stragglers from wandering off and calling out warnings when he spotted potential problems. But on the second day, everything changed. A sudden autumn storm moved in from the west, bringing driving rain and wind that spooked the cattle and made visibility nearly impossible. The herd became restless and difficult to control, and several times small groups of animals broke away from the main group and had to be rounded up by cowboys who were already stretched thin trying to keep the bulk of the herd moving in the right direction. It was during one of these breakaway incidents that Samuel had his first real chance to prove his worth. A dozen young steers, frightened by a lightning flash, suddenly bolted from the herd and headed toward a narrow canyon that led deeper into the mountains. If they reached the canyon, they could scatter through miles of rough country where it might take days to find them. Assuming they could be found at all, Jake Morrison was dealing with another group of panicked cattle and could not respond immediately. The other cowboys were spread out along the length of the herd, each managing his own section. For a crucial moment, Samuel found himself the only person in position to head off the escaping steers before they reached the canyon mouth. Everything Pete had taught him about reading cattle and understanding their behavior suddenly came together in Samuel's mind. He could see that the lead steer was heading for what looked like an easy path through some scattered rocks. But Samuel knew from his exploration of the ranch that the path led to a dead end against a steep cliff face. If he could get there first and position himself correctly, he could turn the entire group back toward the main herd. Without hesitation, Samuel spurred his horse into a gallop, racing across the uneven ground as rain lashed his face and thunder crashed overhead. His horse, a sure-footed gelding named Buck that Pete had selected specifically for Samuel to ride, responded instantly to his guidance, picking the best route through the rocks and sagebrush, with the instinct of an animal bred for this kind of work. Samuel reached the mouth of the false path just as the lead steer arrived, and for a moment boy and animal faced each other in a test of wills that would determine whether the cattle would be saved or lost. The steer was larger and stronger, but Samuel had position and determination on his side. He began waving his hat and calling out in the loud, commanding voice that the cowboys used to control cattle, a technique he had practiced but never used in a real emergency. The lead steer hesitated, confused by this unexpected obstacle, and in that moment of uncertainty Samuel pressed his advantage, pushing Buck forward to block the path more completely. The other steers, following the lead animal's example, also came to a stop, missing around uncertainly as they looked for another escape route. Samuel kept moving, using his horse to gradually turn them back toward the main herd, working carefully to avoid spooking them into another panic, but maintaining enough pressure to keep them moving in the right direction. Jake Morrison appeared through the rain just as Samuel successfully delivered the wayward cattle back to the safety of the main group. The foreman's withered face showed surprise and approval as he realized what the boy had accomplished. "Good work, Sam," Jake called out over the wind. "You probably saved us half a day of searching for those steers. That was some fine cowboy work." The praise meant everything to Samuel, coming as it did from a man whose respect had to be earned through competence and courage rather than mere effort. But more than personal satisfaction, Samuel felt a deep sense of belonging, the knowledge that he had contributed something valuable to the success of the operation. The rest of the cattle drive proceeded without major incident, and Samuel's confidence grew with each passing day. He learned to anticipate problems before they developed, to work smoothly with the other cowboys as part of an experienced team, and to handle the long hours and difficult conditions without complaint. When they finally reached the winter range and the herd was safely settled in the valley pastures near the ranch buildings, William rode up to where Samuel was unsaddling Buck after the final day of the drive. "Jake tells me you did exceptional work out there," William said, his voice carrying a note of pride that made Samuel's heart swell. "He said you handled yourself like a seasoned cowboy, especially during that storm when those steers broke away." Samuel flushed with pleasure at the recognition, but he was also aware that his success had been built on the foundation of everything he had learned from Pete, Jake, and the other men who had patiently taught him their skills. "I just tried to remember what everyone taught me," Samuel replied. "Pete always said the most important thing was to stay calm and think through the problem instead of just reacting." William nodded approvingly. "Good advice, and you followed it well. But it takes more than just following advice to handle a situation like that. It takes judgment, courage, and the ability to act decisively when action is needed. Those are qualities that can't be taught. They have to come from within." That evening, as the cowboys gathered in the bunkhouse to celebrate the successful completion of another cattle drive, Samuel found himself accepted as a full member of the team for the first time. The men who had initially been polite but reserved in their treatment of him now included him in their conversations and jokes as an equal, someone who had proven himself worthy of their respect. Red Sullivan, the head wrangler, approached Samuel during the evening and made an offer that represented the ultimate acceptance into the cowboy brotherhood. "Sam, I've been watching how you work with horses, and I think you've got real potential as a horseman. Would you like me to teach you some of the finer points of training and breaking horses? It's specialized work, and not everyone has the temperament for it, but I think you might." Samuel accepted eagerly, understanding that this was both an honor and an opportunity to learn skills that would make him even more valuable to the ranch operation. Working with horses required a combination of patience, understanding, and quiet authority that appealed to something deep in Samuel's character. As winter settled over the Broken Arrow Ranch, Samuel's education continued in new directions. He spent mornings with Red learning the subtle art of horse training, afternoons helping Pete with equipment maintenance and repair, and evenings with William learning about the business aspects of ranching. William had begun sharing more details about the financial side of the operation, teaching Samuel to understand profit and loss statements, cattle market fluctuations, and the complex decisions involved in managing a large ranch. Samuel absorbed this information eagerly, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was beginning to think like a businessman as well as a cowboy. One evening in December, as they sat by the fireplace going over the ranch's annual financial reports, William made a comment that surprised Samuel with its implications. "You know, Sam, most young men your age would be bored by all these numbers and business details. They'd rather be out riding horses or proving how tough they are. But you seem genuinely interested in understanding how everything fits together." Samuel looked up from the ledger he had been studying. "I guess I figure that if I'm going to work on a ranch, I should understand all parts of the operation, not just the parts that happen outside. Besides, it's interesting to see how all the different pieces connect to make the whole thing successful." William smiled at the boy's thoughtful response. "That's exactly the right attitude. A ranch is like a big complex machine, where every part depends on every other part. The cowboys who only understand cattle, or the businessmen who only understand markets, they can never run an operation like this as well as someone who sees the whole picture." It was during these quiet winter conversations that William began to reveal more of his thinking about Samuel's future at the Broken Arrow. He spoke about the importance of having someone to carry on the work when he was too old to continue, about the satisfaction of building something that would last beyond his own lifetime. Samuel listened carefully to these discussions, beginning to understand that William was offering him far more than just a temporary home or a job. The older man was sharing his vision of the ranch's future, and Samuel was starting to realize that he might be intended to play a central role in that vision. The realization was both thrilling and daunting. Samuel had never imagined that he might someday be responsible for managing an operation as large and complex as the Broken Arrow Ranch. The boy who had been abandoned on a mountain trail was being groomed to inherit one of the most successful ranches in Colorado. But with this understanding came a new sense of responsibility. If William was truly considering him as a potential heir, then Samuel knew he had to continue proving himself worthy of such trust. Every skill he learned, every decision he made, every interaction with the ranch hands would be a test of his readiness for the enormous responsibility that might someday be his. As the snow deepened around the ranch buildings and the long winter night settled over the valley, Samuel threw himself into his education with renewed determination. He was no longer just a grateful boy learning useful skills, he was a young man preparing himself to inherit a legacy that represented decades of hard work, careful planning, and unwavering dedication to excellence. The transformation from abandoned orphan to potential heir was nearly complete, but the final test of Samuel's character was yet to come. That test would arrive with the spring thaw, when a crisis would threaten everything William had built, and Samuel would have to prove that he was truly ready to be trusted with the future of the Broken Arrow Ranch. The crisis that would test Samuel's worthiness as William's heir began with what seemed like a routine business decision. In early spring of 1924, when Samuel had been at the Broken Arrow Ranch for 8 months, William received an offer to purchase 500 head of premium breeding cattle from a rancher in Texas who was retiring from the business. The cattle represented an exceptional opportunity to improve the quality of the Broken Arrow's herd through the introduction of superior bloodlines. The investment would cost nearly half of William's available cash reserves, but the long-term benefits could be enormous if the cattle proved to breed successfully in Colorado's climate and conditions. William had built his fortune through calculated risks, and this purchase fit his pattern of investing in quality over quantity. He discussed the opportunity extensively with Samuel during their evening business sessions, explaining the genetic principles involved in selective breeding and the financial calculations that made the purchase worthwhile despite its high cost. Samuel listened intently to these discussions, asking questions that showed he was beginning to understand the complex interplay between genetics, economics, and environmental factors that determine success in the cattle business. When William asked for his opinion, Samuel carefully reviewed all the factors before offering his assessment. "It seems like a good opportunity if we're confident about our ability to manage the transition," Samuel said thoughtfully. "The genetics look excellent, and the price is fair for cattle of this quality. The main risk is whether they'll adapt well to our climate and whether we can maintain the breeding program successfully." William was impressed by Samuel's analysis, which showed the boy was thinking through all the relevant factors rather than just focusing on the obvious benefits. The decision to proceed with the purchase was finalized, and arrangements were made to transport the cattle from Texas to Colorado in early summer. The trouble began when the cattle arrived and were placed in quarantine pastures to ensure they carried no diseases that might infect the existing herd. The initial veterinary examination showed no problems, and after the required waiting period, the new cattle were gradually integrated with the Broken Arrow's existing stock. But within 2 weeks, cattle from both the new herd and the original stock began showing signs of a mysterious illness. Animals that had been healthy and vigorous suddenly became lethargic, stopped eating, and developed symptoms that the local veterinarian had never seen before. Within days, several animals had died, and the mysterious disease was spreading rapidly through both herds. William called in veterinary experts from Denver and even as far away as Kansas City, but none of them could immediately identify the disease or recommend an effective treatment. Meanwhile, cattle continued to sicken and die at an alarming rate, threatening to destroy the entire herd that represented William's life work. The financial implications were catastrophic. Not only had William paid a significant sum for the Texas cattle, but the loss of his breeding stock would make it impossible to maintain his market contracts. Without cattle to sell, he would be unable to pay his debts or meet payroll for his employees. The Broken Arrow Ranch, built over decades of careful management, was facing potential bankruptcy within months. Word of the disease outbreak spread quickly through the region, and neighboring ranchers began taking precautions to protect their own herds. Some demanded that William quarantine his entire property, effectively cutting off access to markets and suppliers. Others whispered that the outbreak was proof of poor judgment in purchasing the Texas cattle, that William had taken one risk too many and finally paid the price. As the crisis deepened, William aged visibly under the stress. The man who had always seemed invincible to Samuel now looked tired and worried, spending sleepless nights walking among the sick animals and trying to find some solution to save his life's work. It was during this darkest period that Samuel stepped forward to prove his worth in ways no one could have anticipated. While the adults focused on finding medical solutions and managing the immediate crisis, Samuel began his own investigation into the disease outbreak. He spent hours observing the sick animals, noting patterns in their symptoms and behavior. He studied the timing of the outbreak, tracking which animals had become sick first and how the disease had spread. He examined the pastures where the cattle grazed, the water sources they used, and the feed they consumed, looking for anything unusual that might explain the mysterious illness. Samuel's investigation led him to notice something that the veterinary experts had overlooked. The disease seemed to be affecting cattle in certain areas of the ranch more severely than others, and the pattern of infection did not match what would be expected from a contagious disease spreading between animals. Acting on a hunch, Samuel began testing water sources throughout the ranch, collecting samples from streams, ponds, and wells that supplied water to different pastures. He had learned basic chemistry from William's books and knew how to perform simple tests for contamination, though he lacked the equipment for more sophisticated analysis. What he found was a subtle but significant difference in the mineral content of water from different sources. The areas with the highest rates of cattle illness were all supplied by water sources that showed elevated levels of certain minerals, particularly selenium, which Samuel knew could be toxic to cattle in high concentrations. Further investigation revealed that recent spring flooding had altered underground water flows, causing water from some previously isolated mineral deposits to mix with the ranch's regular water supplies. The toxic levels were not high enough to cause immediate death, but sustained consumption over several weeks had gradually poisoned the affected animals. Samuel brought his findings to William and the veterinary experts, who initially were skeptical that a 14-year-old boy could have discovered something they had missed. But when they tested Samuel's water samples and examined the geographic pattern of the disease outbreak, they had to admit that his theory explained the evidence better than any of their previous hypotheses. Once the source of the problem was identified, the solution was relatively straightforward. The contaminated water sources were temporarily blocked, and fresh water was trucked in from uncontaminated sources. The sick cattle were treated with medications to help their bodies process the accumulated toxins, and gradually the outbreak began to subside. But while Samuel's detective work had solved the immediate crisis, the financial damage had already been done. Many cattle had been lost, veterinary bills had mounted into thousands of dollars, and the disruption to normal operations had cost William several important market contracts. The ranch was still facing serious financial difficulties that threatened its long-term survival. It was then that Samuel made a proposal that surprised everyone, including William himself. During one of their evening meetings to assess the ranch's financial position, Samuel asked if he could speak privately with William about a possible solution to their problems. "I've been thinking about our situation," Samuel began carefully, "and I have an idea that might help, but I want to know what you think before I suggest it to anyone else." William encouraged him to continue. curious about what solution a teenage boy might propose for such complex financial difficulties. The problem is that we need cash immediately to pay debts and keep the ranch operating, but our main asset is land that would take months to sell and wouldn't bring full value in a forced sale, Samuel explained. What if instead of trying to sell assets, we brought in partners who could provide the capital we need in exchange for a share of future profits? Samuel had been studying the ranch's books carefully and had identified several wealthy ranchers and businessmen who had previously expressed interest in investing in William's operation. His proposal was to approach these potential investors with a partnership offer that would provide immediate capital in exchange for a percentage of the ranch's profits over a specified period. The advantage, Samuel continued, is that we keep control of the land and operations while getting the money we need to survive this crisis. The investors get a good return on their money without having to manage the day-to-day operations themselves. And once we've recovered from this setback, we can buy back their shares if we want to return to full ownership. William was amazed by the sophistication of Samuel's proposal. The boy had not only identified the core financial problem correctly, but had devised a solution that protected the ranch's long-term interests while addressing its immediate needs. Together, they refined Samuel's plan and approached 3 potential investors with the partnership proposal. The negotiations were complex, but William was impressed by Samuel's contributions to the discussions. The boy understood the financial details, asked intelligent questions, and even suggested modifications to the proposed terms that better protected the ranch's interests. Within a month, they had secured sufficient investment to stabilize the ranch's finances and begin rebuilding the depleted cattle herd. The crisis that had threatened to destroy everything William had built instead became the foundation for an even stronger operation, with additional capital for expansion and improvement. But more importantly for Samuel's future, the crisis had definitively proven his worth as William's potential heir. His investigation had saved the ranch from complete disaster, and his financial acumen had provided the solution for recovery. He had shown intelligence, initiative, and the kind of innovative thinking that would be essential for managing a complex business operation. On a warm evening in late summer, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, William finally spoke the words that Samuel had been hoping to hear for months. "Sam, I've been thinking about the future of this ranch, about what will happen to it when I'm too old to run it properly. I've been looking for someone I could trust with everything I've built here. Someone who understands not just the work, but the responsibility that goes with it." Samuel's heart began beating faster, sensing that this conversation would change his life forever. "I want you to know," William continued, "that I'm going to make you my legal heir. I'm having papers drawn up that will make you my adopted son and the inheritor of the Broken Arrow Ranch when I'm gone. But more than that, I want to start turning over more responsibility to you now, so you can begin learning what it means to truly run this operation." The words hit Samuel with an emotional force that left him temporarily speechless. The abandoned boy who had been left on a mountain trail was being offered not just wealth and property, but a family and a legacy that would last for generations. "I know it's a big responsibility," William said gently, seeing the boy's overwhelmed expression. "And you don't have to answer right now. But I want you to know that this isn't charity or sentiment. You've earned this through your character, your abilities, and your dedication to this place and these people." When Samuel finally found his voice, it was thick with emotion. "Mr. Hartley, William, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've given me. You saved my life that night when you took me in, and you've given me opportunities I never could have imagined. I promise you that if you trust me with this inheritance, I'll do everything in my power to honor your faith in me." The legal adoption was completed within a month, and Samuel Thompson officially became Samuel Hartley, heir to one of the most successful ranches in Colorado. But the change in name was less important than the change in responsibility that came with his new status. William began gradually transferring more decision-making authority to Samuel, consulting with him on all major business decisions, and encouraging him to take the lead in areas where he had shown particular aptitude. Samuel threw himself into this expanded role with the same determination he had shown in learning basic ranch skills, constantly seeking to improve his understanding of every aspect of the operation. Under the combined leadership of William's experience and Samuel's innovative thinking, the Broken Arrow Ranch not only recovered from the crisis but began a period of unprecedented growth and prosperity. The partnership investments that Samuel had arranged provided capital for expansion, and the improved cattle bloodlines eventually produced the superior stock that William had hoped for when he made the original purchase. As the years passed, Samuel grew into his role as William's successor, earning the respect of competitors and business partners throughout the region. The story of the abandoned boy who became a ranch heir became legendary in Colorado cattle country, inspiring other young people and reminding everyone who heard it that determination and character could overcome even the most difficult circumstances. But perhaps the most important aspect of Samuel's transformation was not his material success but the family he had found and the legacy he would eventually pass on to future generations. The Broken Arrow Ranch became known not just for its prosperity but for its fair treatment of employees, its contributions to the community, and its commitment to the principles of hard work and integrity that William and Samuel shared. When William Hartley finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Samuel Hartley stood as the full owner of one of the most successful ranches in the American West. But more than inheriting property and wealth, he had inherited a set of values and a way of life that would guide him for the rest of his days. The cruel stepmother who had abandoned a 12-year-old boy on a mountain trail had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would transform that boy into one of the most respected ranchers in Colorado. Samuel's story became proof that sometimes our greatest disasters become the doorways to our greatest triumphs, and that kindness and hard work can overcome any obstacle that life places in our path. The Broken Arrow Ranch continued to prosper under Samuel's leadership for decades to come, and the boy who had once had nothing became a man who had everything that truly mattered: family, purpose, and the satisfaction of building something lasting and worthwhile. His story reminded everyone who heard it that in America, no matter how humble your beginnings, you could rise to achieve anything if you had courage, determination, and the good fortune to meet people who believed in your potential.